everyone, welcome to our review of the classification of animals. So we are looking at only the animal kingdom. If we look back here, we can see that there are six kingdoms: eubacteria, archaeobacteria, plants, animals, fungi, and protists. And we are only looking at the animal kingdom here. Now, if you look down in the bottom corner of this slideshow, you're going to see four different pictures. You see a sponge, a flatworm, a snail, and a possum, and all four of those organisms are types of animals, but they are very different. So the animal kingdom can be broken down into many different phyla, and then further broken down into classes and orders and families, and even most specifically into genus and species. But let's talk about how we start to break these animals down and group them based on certain characteristics. In general, we look at different characteristics like symmetry, nutrients, respiration, circulation, excretion, nervous system movement, and reproduction. And those characteristics can be broken down. You can see that there are different levels of complexity within each of those characteristics. So, for example, symmetry. You have some organisms that are asymmetrical, like the porifera, sponges. They have no symmetry at all. Then you have some organisms that have radial symmetry. That's the type of symmetry that goes around a circle. And those include Cnidaria and also our echinoderms. So Cnidaria like corals and jellies, and echinoderms like starfish. And then actually all the rest of our organisms, whether they're flatworms, roundworms, segmented worms, clams, different types of fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and different types of mammals, they all have bilateral symmetry. Bilateral symmetry is the most complex type of symmetry. Next, we also talk about the nutrients, the way that our organisms obtain nutrients, and those can be very, very, very simple or very complex. So, with obtaining nutrients, we have porifera, which is our sponges, and they rely completely on filter feeding. That means that they just sit and let water pass through them, and they collect nutrients from the water as the water passes through them. Pretty much all of the other groups of animals that we talked about are more complex in terms of getting nutrients. Sponges are simplest, they just do filter feeding, but the rest could be herbivores, could be carnivores, could be omnivores, or even detritivores eating dead organisms like the annelids. Some of them, like our earthworms, are detritivores. All right, next we talk about respiration. Respiration means how does the organism obtain oxygen? And animals can get oxygen in a couple different ways. They can do diffusion, which basically moves oxygen from a high concentration to an area of low concentration. They can have gills. Many of our jawless fish, cartilaginous fish, and bony fish, and even amphibians, when they're young, have gills to do respiration. And some of our more complex organisms are going to actually have lungs in order to obtain oxygen. So, amphibians like frogs and reptiles, birds, and all different types of mammals actually have lungs. But the simplest way to do respiration to get oxygen is just diffusion. So sponges and flatworms and roundworms and some of these other organisms are just going to allow oxygen to diffuse into their bodies, and that's going to help them obtain oxygen. Next, you don't want to just get oxygen, but you want to be able to move it around throughout your body, and that's called circulation. The movement of oxygen around the body is circulation, and that can be done by diffusion for the simplest organisms, like especially like sponges and jellyfish, which are called cnidarians. They do diffusion to do their circulation. They're very simple. Other types of organisms might have an open circulatory system. So, what that means is that they do not have blood vessels like arteries and veins. For example, in arthropods, our insects have an open circulatory system. They do not have a complex set of arteries and veins to move blood around their bodies. Instead, they just have a simple heart that kind of like gushes blood like material throughout their body, and it is not very complex or organized. And then we could have circulation be a closed circulatory system. All of these complex organisms, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and our mammals, have a closed circulatory system. That means that they have hearts and blood vessels, arteries, and veins to help move their oxygen around the body to where it needs to be in an organized way. Next characteristic or trend we would talk about is with excretion. Excretion means getting rid of waste out of the body. And I'm not talking about like your digestive system here. I'm talking about your liquid waste. So excretion is the removal of liquid waste. It can happen by diffusion, meaning it just waste moves from area of high concentration in the body to outside of the body. That happens in sponges and cnidarians and flatworms, some of our simple organisms. And then excretion can become more complex. So some of our later organisms, such as the flatworms, have specialized cells that actually help them remove liquid waste from their body. So do the roundworms. Those are things like flame cells and Malpighian tubes, but they don't have fully formed kidneys. You have to wait until the more complex organisms like amphibians, birds, reptiles, and mammals to get the complex kidneys, which take our blood and filter it and get rid of all the waste products and extra water, and then we end up urinating that waste. Our excretory system is urination for most complex mammals. The nervous system can be very simple, or more complex organisms have a well developed nervous system with what we call cephalization. Cephalization means a concentration of nerve cells in the front of the body. Another word for that would be if you have cephalization, you have a head with a brain in it. So, some of our organisms, especially the ones that have radial or asymmetrical symmetry, they just don't even have a nervous system. So, for example, porifera, sponges don't have any nervous system at all. Cnidarians don't really have a nervous system. But as you get more complex, you start to develop bilateral symmetry and you start to develop cephalization. So platyhelminthes or flatworms are actually the first species to develop cephalization. They actually have a head. They have a simple brain, and they have eye spots. So they're a little more complex. Now, granted, flatworms' brain or concentration of nerves is extremely complex. They cannot do complex thinking, but some of our later organisms, like birds and mammals, reptiles, amphibians, can actually do complex thinking, and we are cephalized. We have heads, we have brains. Next way to categorize organisms is through their movement. They can be either sessile or motile. That means that if they're sessile, they do not move. They're stuck in one place, like a sponge is stuck in one place, and corals, which are a type of cnidarian, are stuck in one place. They're sessile. Our more complex organisms are motile. That means that they can move to do things like hunt and reproduce and respond to their environment. If they're motile, they can move. And then finally, we talk about reproduction. That is asexual and sexual reproduction. Our asexual reproducers are actually able to reproduce without encountering or finding a mate, and our sexual reproducers must find a mate. The benefit of sexual reproduction, like we've talked about before, is that you have offspring who are genetically different, and that means that you could improve your species through many generations and possibly over like hundreds of thousands of generations actually evolve to become a more complex species of organisms. So as you think about these general trends and ideas with animal classification, like symmetry, nutrients, respiration, circulation, excretion, nervous system movement, and reproduction, think about which animals make advancements in those trends. And as you see here, this lists a whole bunch of different types of animals, but it goes from the least complex all the way to the most complex. Our least complex organisms that are in the animal kingdom are sponges or porifera. Then we have cnidarians. Then platyhelminthes are flatworms. Nematodes are roundworms. Annelids are segmented worms like earthworms. Mollusks are going to be things like clams, slug, octopus, snails. Arthropods include insects, arachnids, and crustaceans. Echinoderms are starfish, sea urchins, and sea cucumbers. Nonvertebrate chordates are tunicates. Jawless fish are hagfish, lancelets, and lampreys. Cartilaginous fish are things like sharks, skates, and rays. Bony fish include clownfish, bass, catfish, and many other type of fish you might think of. Amphibians are born in the water and then live on land and go back to the water to lay eggs. Those are frogs and salamanders. Reptiles have hard outer shells on their eggs, and they are able to reproduce on land without water. Those include snakes, lizards, turtles, gators, and many others. Birds also have hard-shelled eggs. They include penguins, sparrows, eagles, ostriches, many other types of birds. Monotremes include platypus, echidnas, and several other small species. And marsupials include kangaroos, koalas, wombats. They have pouches when they reproduce. That's different from monotremes. Monotremes are mammals who lay eggs. Marsupials are mammals who have pouches. And then we have placental mammals. That means they're mammals who carry their young inside. And that's dolphins, tigers, giraffes, and even humans. So these are just in order from least complex to most complex animals. Thank you for listening.